in a place called North Park. It's been a little gentrified since then, so if you visit it, you'll like it a little bit more now. But back in the 80s, because I'm so old, it didn't look that way. I went to 5 different elementary schools. My parents had me pretty young, which was okay, but they just, were kind of stuck in a place where they didn't know much, and they didn't have a lot of community there. They left Utah when I was a baby to go to San Diego. My dad was an addict. He has been sober now for, how many years? I don't know, 35? So pretty remarkable. Yeah, pretty remarkable. And he got sober when I was almost 8. So that's when we moved to the suburbs. That's where the timing of that kind of lives. So I grew up, I was the oldest. I grew up in a house, and my sister, who's 2 years younger than me, is here too. I think because my family's sitting in the front row, at some point I'm going to make them all do something tonight. Just haven't quite decided what that is yet. But I grew up in a house where I had to learn really quickly how to use my nervous system to protect myself. And that's such an important part of our nervous system, right? That's our nervous system's only job, is to protect ourselves. And it's really a helpful tool. It's a friend in that way. Ignore, I guess, but it's not something to necessarily think is dangerous either. That nervous system that I had saved my life, I think, many, many times growing up. It kept me feeling safe and protected in a world that wasn't always safe for me, especially emotionally. And so I have a lot of compassion for people who feel anxious or have a nervous system that over-responds, because it's not our fault. Our nervous systems are inside of us to help us stay safe. So keeping that in mind is going to be really important as I talk to you about what to do with that nervous system. On the right, oh, it's okay. You can go back, though. Good, I did do the signal, so that's my bad. On the right there is, this is the part where I always get emotional. They're my 2 kids. I have 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. I have a daughter who lives in Massachusetts at a fancy private college now. She's studying Middle Eastern studies, would be mortified to be here tonight, so she's glad she's not somewhere across the country. Really bright, really awesome kid, also not very in touch with her feelings. So despite what you may think, having a therapist for a mom doesn't really work for all things. And then my son, he is a junior. He goes to Box Elder High School. His name is Deacon, and he has a rare chromosome abnormality called ring 18. And this nervous system of mine that I grew up with became really, really helpful again when I had him, because suddenly the world became really, really scary. And he wasn't supposed to live. He was, they actually were going to take him before his due date. But he lived, he survived the due date, and he's still here 16 years later. So there's always a threat in the back of my mind that today may be my last day with him. And I've used to I've developed a way to use that to my advantage, which I hope you guys will too by the end of today. Okay, sign. What is anxiety? Anxiety is, basically, there's a part of our nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system, and that's connected to the most primal part of our brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the part of our brain that tells us if something is scary, basically. So if you are scared of spiders, for example, and you see a spider in the corner of the wall, and you're like, somebody get that spider, I hate spiders, and you jump up and you have this really visceral response. That's your amygdala firing and telling your sympathetic nervous system to arouse and freak out. And when we freak out, the frontal lobe, the most important part of our brain, the part of our brain that helps us, answer questions, engage in dialogue, try to assess safety in a real rational way, the part of our brain we use the most, that's the most helpful, completely shuts off. And that's just science. So anytime we have a sympathetic nervous system arousal, we're not able to access our frontal lobe. So I don't know about you guys, but the worst thing in the world somebody can tell me when my nervous system is activated is to calm down. I don't know if that works for you. It doesn't work for me. Because it just makes me angry. Because I'm feeling so upset inside my body in that moment, and I can't access my frontal lobe. And I know that I probably should calm down, like that feeling is there because I'm a rational person, but I can't access it right now. So when we tell somebody to calm down, when they're upset or they're anxious, all we're doing is escalating the behavior. So, first clue of the night. By the way, I still do that to people. It doesn't go over well. Anxiety is a pervasive worry. It's avoidance-based. So let's say, again, to use the spider example, you don't like spiders. But you're like, okay, when I see a spider, I freak out, I hit it, or I tell somebody to go kill it, or whatever. We release it safely into Spiderville with his friends. Whatever we decide to do in that moment, we can just kind of get over it. But when we have an anxiety disorder, it means that we're worrying about the fact that maybe there's a spider on the stage right now, or maybe there's a spider crawling on our body, or maybe there's a spider, in the shower, and we have to check before we get into the shower. So anxiety is the pervasive worry about there being a spider, to the point where maybe you might even avoid certain situations because of the spider. Make sense? Fear is really reflexive. Fear is the part of that amygdala that I talked to you about, is the part that you really don't have any control over. So if you're feeling like something is threatening your life, and we can misinterpret that often, you have no choice but to just react to it reflexively. And that usually goes up and down really, really quickly. We have a fear sometimes that if we're afraid, it's going to stay up here at a really high level. But usually we're just afraid for a minute and then it drops right back down. But it's super reflexive. And then trauma. Trauma is similar to anxiety in that it kind of, is a nervous system response that you can't control, and it's usually based in something that you have experienced. So it imprints in your memory system, your long-term memory system, and it kind of is like a jack-in-the-box where it just pops up whenever it wants. That's the difference between anxiety and trauma. So I hear from my clients all the time that when they feel anxious, they can't control it. With what I've told you thus far, do you think that that's true? I want you to think about that. I don't know if you have the answer yet, but I want you to think about that. Okay. This is just, I was really proud of this because it took me like 45 minutes to make on some little art app, actually. So I think I just put it in there because of the time I spent making it a while ago. But basically, it's a visual that just says exactly what I just said. And I put the lion on there because it is the most primal part of our brain. So when we're dealing with fear, anything that has to do with fear, remember, we can't override that with anything. Our frontal lobe does not connect to our amygdala when it's ignited. Okay. So, I have people tell me all the time, or ask me all the time, if they have an anxiety disorder. And you probably have been guilty of saying, I know I'm guilty of saying, well, I just feel anxious, or I just have anxiety, right? And we kind of lump that into this really disordered or pathological way of thinking. But having an anxiety disorder is very, very different than having anxiety. When I asked you guys to raise your hands at the beginning, I really did that for a reason, because all of us in this room should have anxiety. The only people, and so maybe you want to look around the room before I tell you this, but the only people that science tells us don't have anxiety are psychopaths. So if somebody didn't raise their hand, you might want to scooch over a little bit. But it's true, and we're supposed to. We're built to have anxiety. We're built to feel fear. We're built to protect ourselves. So to feel anxious about something isn't necessarily something to be worried about, okay? An anxiety disorder means that the feeling of anxiety, that nervous system, is operating at an extra sensitive level, and it's impacting your daily life functioning. So how that looks for a child would be maybe they're avoiding school, or they're throwing fits that are escalating to avoid school, or when they get to school, they can't take any tests and they feel like they just need to sit in the desk and not do anything all day, right? It's really impacting their functioning at school. For a teenager, that could look very similarly, but it could also look like anger and irritability, because teenagers in general, their job is to find who they are and to develop their own identity. And so it can be really frustrating to be a teenager and have an anxiety disorder because it makes you feel like you're dependent on other people. So oftentimes that manifests as anger or irritation for teenagers. And in adults, it's usually an impact to their work functioning. If you can't hold a job, or if you feel like people are talking about you badly at work, and so you continuously change jobs, right? Something like that, that feels like it's impacting your daily life. So you can have anxiety and not have an anxiety disorder. Any questions on that? And I'm gonna start calling people, just by the way, if you don't have questions, because I'll tell you why in a minute. Okay. I feel like I'm a football ref. First down. Okay. So this is the cycle of anxiety. We have triggers. And you guys have probably heard that word often. It's a word that we use, I think overuse in our culture and in popular media. Triggers aren't bad. Triggers are just the things that make you feel anxious, right? And they might be the same, like spiders or snakes or whatever. I hate snakes. Or heights or public speaking. But they might be really specific to your life experiences. I have some that are really specific to my life experiences and what I went through. Now, when we have triggers, we have a process of automatic thoughts that come next. And this is a little bit of a soapbox for me. In fact, I DM'd my mom, who posted this stupid thing on her Instagram story the other day. Sorry, Mom, if you're here. I don't know if she's here. She was maybe coming. Okay, great. I said that a little too late. But she was talking about changing your thinking. And I could stand on a soapbox till the day that I die about this idea of changing our thoughts. Because science, actual science, tells us that we have upwards of 40,000 thoughts a day. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think, some days I feel like I'm thinking about 40,000 things. That's true. But I don't. And there's this process of trash control with our thoughts, where these automatic thoughts filter through our biases, filter through our memories, filter through our short-term kind of experiences, and our brain decides which to keep and which to toss. So our thoughts are completely automatic. Now, are they subjective? Yes. Are they based in our experiences? Yes. Are they reactive sometimes? Yes. But we can't change them. We just can't. There's a step next called metacognition. And metacognition is the part that makes us uniquely human. There's a couple of other mammals that we think experience it a little bit, but for the most part, humans are the only species that think about their thinking. So we will have a thought, and then we're like, why did I think that? Right? And then we give energy to that thought, and then that thought kind of ruminates, stays stuck. A great example of this that I share with my clients who have OCD all the time, and OCD is a little bit different. I won't go into that today. There are some similarities to what I'm talking about, but it's a little bit different. Whenever I drive, I'm a really good driver. I'm not gonna say I'm a terrible driver, despite what my family would say right there. I just like to drive fast. I don't see a problem with that. But I drive fast, and I'm gonna offend people here, so I'm sorry in advance for the offensive comment that I'm about to make, but I have a real distaste for minivans. I just feel like they're always busy doing other things on the road, and I would just like to go fast. So whenever I see a minivan and I'm driving, I'm like, I wish that minivan would run off the road. That's a pretty bad thought. That's pretty intense, right? And if I were to give energy to that automatic thought, I could turn into a murderer or something, right? Or at least question my own morality. But I don't. I'm always like, Jenny, come on, slow down a little bit. You don't really hate minivans. You don't really hate people. You like them. And then I move on and I don't think about it. That whole process is like a 5-second process most of the time, unless they're a really bad minivan. But it's the energy we give to our thoughts that poses the problem. And that is a really, really, really crucial distinction. Because I can't tell you how many times I see people post this stuff on the internet where they're like, I'm just gonna change my thinking. My New Year's resolution is to think more positively about myself. And I'm like, good luck, dude. We all think crappy thoughts about ourselves. We just don't need to give them energy. We don't need to let them stay stuck in our brain. I don't think I'm a bad person because I have those thoughts of minivans while I'm driving on the freeway. I know I'm not a bad person, right? I question that thought. I don't let it stay. I'm like, dude, come on, like, you don't think that thought. You're all right. And then I move on. So this idea that we have to use our thoughts to control who we are or to control our feelings is absolutely not based in science. It just doesn't work that way. So we have a trigger. Nope, back. We moved the chains backwards. Okay. Then we have, I need to figure out a different thing. I'm going to use this arm when I need you to move the slide. Automatic thoughts, metacognition, and then we have an emotional response. Now, I am 1,000% guilty of telling people often that I can't help the way that I'm feeling. And that's true to a certain degree. But if you look on this cycle of anxiety and just how emotions in our brain work, emotions are like fourth down the line. So we have an automatic thought, we give energy to that thought, and then we feel something. That's how that works. And I think that's so interesting because I see people call me or walk into my office, my video office now most of the time, and tell me that their whole day is ruined because of some particular way that they're feeling. And every single time somebody brings that out, I revert back to this slide. I probably share this 100 times a week in session. Because yeah, you might be feeling that way, but let's talk about the beginning of how this started. And let's talk about where we can put our energy. After the emotional response, we have avoidance. And this is really specific to anxiety. So when we're feeling triggered, I always use an example that I'm kind of embarrassed to use because my boyfriend's here, but I'm going to use it anyway. My example that I use here is dating. It's a huge trigger for me. I absolutely hate it. I've hated it my whole life. It's put me in some really bad situations, but it's a trigger for me. So if I'm triggered because I've got to go out on this date with somebody, and then I have automatic thoughts of, freaking hate dating. I don't want to go on this date. I hate everybody. It's stupid. I have dumb conversations. I don't want to get ready. I want to wear sweatpants. Like all those things go through my mind, right? And if I sit there and like absorb those automatic thoughts based off of my experiences, based off of my history, based off of my biases, then I'm probably going to cancel, right? And I've done that a million times, often. I use my son as an excuse, don't tell him. He's nonverbal, so he doesn't know that part. But when we avoid something, looking at that picture, what happens to that cycle? It's just reinforced. Exactly. It's like a riverbed. The more you run it, the deeper it gets. The more it becomes your truth. Right? So if I avoid going on that date, the next time somebody asks me out, I'm a lot more likely to just say no before I even have that emotional response because I don't want to have that emotional response. It was uncomfortable, right? And I don't want to deal with that discomfort. So avoidance is the drug of choice for anxiety, always. And that's really important to think about. Because when we are working with our kids, or if we're teenagers in this room and we're thinking about things that like we want to quit or we don't want to do anymore, oftentimes you'll hear people talk about, and I'm going to have another unpopular opinion, which is pretty par for the course for me, but when Simone Biles was in the Olympics, in the Summer Olympics, I can't remember what summer it was, a couple summers ago, and she messed up, right? And then she said she needed to take a break for her mental health, and she didn't get back on and join her team, and it kind of, messed up all of her teammates. She was applauded by a lot in the mental health community for, putting her mental health in the forefront, of which I concur. But if I'm talking about anxiety, and I'm talking about this cycle, if she's on that big of a stage, and she just told her brain that she can't tolerate the discomfort of failing on that big of a stage, what did that do to her riverbed? Exactly. Exactly. And for me, that sent, as like an exposure therapist, like just chills up my whole body. Because here we were having a conversation of how that was the right thing to do. And again, I don't know her. I'm totally judging the situation as a therapist, right? But I feel like what that does is send this message that when things are uncomfortable, we avoid them. If we feel anxious, we avoid it. And what I know to be true about the brain, what I know to be true about our nervous system, what I know to be true about science, tells me that that's the exact opposite of what we should do in a situation like that. Okay. So, how do we break this cycle? There's a word up there. I put a big spider on it. Again, I was really proud of that graphic, so enjoy it. Exposure response prevention is the type of therapy that I specialize in, and it's also the type of therapy that's the gold standard for treatment for OCD, and it's the gold standard of treatment for most PTSD cases, with a little bit of an asterisk there, depending on the case, and it's the gold standard of treatment for anxiety now. And if you can guess from the name what it is, it's exactly what you think, which is exposing yourself to the fear and preventing a response, preventing avoidance. So you actually just have to do it. You have to just do the scary thing. You have to do the hard thing. Okay? So where it fits on this cycle is, you can see, part of my job and part of what you can do in your life. This isn't necessarily something that has to happen with a therapist unless you're really experiencing some deep pathology, some really deep fears that are really limiting. But we are supposed to expose ourselves to the trigger, create those automatic thoughts, not give them energy, experience the emotion, because emotions just are, right? They come and they go like waves, and not avoid it. So I'm going to show you, and I'm hoping this works, it may not, but I want to show you a video clip of a therapy session with exposure. It's only like 3 minutes long. This is a clip from the film that I was in called Angst. And this is a session that I did, an exposure therapy session with a young man named Max. And I have to tell you a little bit of his story just because it's really cool. He came to me in a treatment center in Utah that's like it's not a lockdown facility. It's kind of like a boarding school for young men who need help with anxiety and OCD. And when he came to me, he wasn't leaving his room. And he'd been that way for about 18 months. He was about 15, 16 when I met him. And so we engaged in some pretty intense exposure therapy. And his fear here, he'll tell you a little bit about what he's afraid of, but I'll give you a little bit of background. What he's afraid of here is social embarrassment, social anxiety, saying the wrong thing to people. The way that this manifests often in our lives is like our kids that don't want to order off the menu when we go out to eat. Or they're like, no, I'm not going to go pay for that at the cashier. You pay for that. Or you talk to my teacher. I don't want to talk to my teacher. That's weird. That's usually what that looks like in our kids. But he had that to a pathological level. So if you scroll down on this web page up there, sorry, I'm talking to tech now, you're going to see a clip on the right, on your right, that says exposure therapy scene. Oh, this might be it. Go ahead and push play. It might have just gone right to the clip.
My hands start to shake.
Oh, this is the trailer, but this will work for a minute.
I feel like I can't breathe. I kind of start to breathe really rapidly and I can't slow my breathing. So then my body starts to think that there's no oxygen and that I'm dying. My vision gets pretty blurry and I can't think. I don't know what the brain does to cause that, but it's nasty.
That's actually a good visual of what it feels like when that amygdala takes over. Go ahead and click on the other video on that page. If you go all the way to the bottom of that front screen, you should see it at the bottom. Down, down, down. Keep going. Exposure therapy. Yep. The most research-based method for treating anxiety is what we call exposure therapy. Essentially, what it is doing what scares you.
My core fear is judgments, and it branches out into OCD. My exposure tomorrow is going to be talking to people in a store about, I guess, what I'm wearing and what looks good.
When we are putting ourselves in situations where we are scared of things, it's often really important to be very mindful. If we're not mindful of how anxious we are, then we can't really keep track. So it's really helpful if when we're doing something that we're really scared of, to put a number to it, to put something tangible to it so that we can understand what it means. You can really place any type of number or label on it that you feel comfortable with, from 0 to 10, 10 being the thing that scares you the very, very most, and 0 being you're laying on a beach with no care in the world. Some people will label that from 0 all the way to 100. It's just whatever works for you and helps you understand that you're getting better. Why do you think that I'm making you do this horrendous thing?
So like doing other things that aren't as horrendous will be easy for me, and I'll be able to do it without having like a lot of discomfort and stuff, I guess.
Yeah.
My brain could like stop for a minute, that'd be great.
I know. You all right? How are you feeling right now?
Let's just do it.
Hey, I know you want to just do it, but I want you to talk to me.
Probably like an 80.
An 80? Okay. All right. You gonna do it? Okay. All right, where are you at?
90?
You're at 90?
Maybe 85.
Go ahead and pick something else.
Okay. Should I just put this on?
I would put on some pants too. Some ski pants. Over to the right. All right, where are you at?
Pretty high.
What does pretty high mean? Well, I guess it was pretty high. I'll give you a little background there too. One of the things that we do in exposure therapy, and again, you can do in your own life and with your kids, is put them in situations where they have to advocate for themselves or ask for things themselves. So what I'm having him do here is a little bit extreme. I'm having him put on something silly and then ask somebody how he looks. And the reason for that is because it addresses directly his fear. And I want his brain to learn that he doesn't have to be afraid of the thing that he's afraid of. And the only way to prove that to his neurology is to actually do it. So this is a little extreme. I don't suggest you you can, it might be fun, but put all your kids in a bunch of weird clothes and ask them to go out and ask people how they look. But for this particular kid, it worked really great. Okay. Hey, Max, you want to put on some ski boots too?
God, no. Try the other one on. There's no way these fit.
Go ask somebody else. I'm also not that mean. That's part of the therapy. I'll explain it to you.
Good. Does this look like it fits? Yeah. Okay. I'm fine.
Go ahead and go change. You're done.
Okay. I feel like afterwards, after you've done the exposure, you really feel confident and capable, and it just really works. You just have to keep going at it, And it's a slow process, but you see results, and you're able to see over time it decreasing.
Thank you. You just want to go, hey, Max. Really, how are you doing?
I don't know, like a 70 still.
70
Did I say that
still?
last?
Was that the most difficult exposure you've done?
It feels like it.
Any questions about that? It looks kind of harsh, and it looks a little bit like the opposite of what we hear to do with somebody with anxiety. Now, this doesn't mean that all the therapy that Max got was based in exposure therapy. A lot of it was. But the only way for him to learn how to live his life independently, and for any of us really, to learn how to live our lives independently, is to do the thing that scares us, to do the thing that feels risky, to do the thing that feels uncomfortable. Now, are there limits within that? Are there boundaries within that? Absolutely, right? Everybody has to do things that feel comfortable for their value system. But at the end of the day, if you're feeling discomfort, that's a really good clue that that's something you want, not something to be avoidant of. What Max really wanted deeply was to live his own independent life. And he did treatment for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years actually, and he went to Willamette College in Oregon and graduated with a 4-year degree after this and had a relationship and is doing really well. He has moments where he still struggles because his nervous system really operates at a high level, and he has OCD, which he explained, which is a little different. But it changed his life to be able to face what he fears. So, on to the next screen. If you go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, there's my dog. She's really cute. And she's also extremely needy and very naughty, but cute. We'll see if it goes back. On that note, where are we at time? You can give me a time. Okay. What I want to do for the next 10 minutes is an open Q&A where you guys, and like I said, I'll just call on you, but an open Q&A where you ask questions about maybe how this would look in your life or any questions you have about anxiety, really. I've heard them all. I want this, usually the first person to do it then lends to about 4,000 other hands, so don't be nervous to do that. But before I do that, I am going to have my niece talk. My niece is in the audience tonight. I warned her. I gave her a 1-day warning yesterday, so she's had 24 hours to prepare. But my niece has gone through exposure therapy, and I'll let her tell you her experience. And she started, gosh, how old were you when you started? Like 7? They're 14? Older, okay. 4th grade, that's right. 4th grade. So I'm going to have her, because I like to do exposure therapy. She's got a mic down there, so you can stand up so people can see you, how pretty you are. And I want her to talk about her experience so you guys can get a perspective from somebody who's lived it on the other side of the fence than mine. Yep, you're live. You can go. So if you want to stand up and look that way, or you can come up here if you can climb. Just jump. There you go. And tell them what your experience was, and then maybe like what you're studying to do now.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Taylor. I didn't avoid this, so that's good.
Yay!
So I started therapy in 4th grade, so I was about like 7, 8.
You're 18.
Yeah, I'm 18. But my first exposure therapy was actually with a bee. I was terrified of bees. And so I had to get a fake dead bee. And is this still? Yeah. Okay.
Just put it a little closer to your, yep.
Okay. So I got a fake, well, it was real. It was a real dead bee. And at first I was really annoyed. I didn't want to do it, so I named it I Hate Mom. It changed its name to Ruby eventually. But yeah, I hated it. It was awful. And exposure therapy, when I first started doing it, it was not fun. But I also like knew it could like help me later on. So thankfully now I can be around bees. Occasionally, I still run away, but way better. And exposure therapy just makes you really uncomfortable during the moment, but after it's really rewarding. And like my most recent exposure therapy, it was actually for OCD instead of anxiety, but it was a couple months ago, and I had to, my room is like, everything's like in its own. It's not like clean, but like it's clean in my head. But I've had to like my mom, for example, would have to go in my room to like move like a perfume bottle or something, just a little bit. And I was really annoyed at first. Always makes me angry, not angry, like, what's the word?
It can be angry or irritable.
Irritable, yeah. Very irritable. But yeah.
So tell them what you're studying now.
I'm actually studying psychology up at UVU now. I've been wanting to actually follow in Jenny's and either be like my own like private practice clinical psychologist or forensic psychologist. It's tied between the two right now. But like I feel like it would be really beneficial for more therapists and stuff in the world to like know more exactly like what goes on in the brain, like personally with OCD and anxiety. So I feel like I can help a lot of people because I know how it feels.
Good job. Give her a round of applause. I'm very proud of her. So to share a little bit about, like, she's come a long way. When she talked about the bee, that was just like the marker for a lot of things that impacted her life and the way that she was able to do things on her own. And the really interesting part about exposing ourselves to our fears and the things that we're afraid of is it's not fear specific. So every time you look at that bee or every time you get that spider and you go and stand by it, your brain learns that you can tolerate fear. It's not learning in specifics. It doesn't just learn, oh, I can like handle spiders now. What it learns is that you can actually tolerate discomfort. And from my perspective, the tolerance of discomfort is like the key to success in life. Because everything good that we do comes on the end of discomfort, always. I can't think of anything in life that's good that doesn't come until you do something uncomfortable. And so I think it's really important to know that you can create that for yourself. Yes, deep breathing, yes, like imagery, yes, all that stuff is helpful. That's like the really cliched therapeutic approach to anxiety. I'm not saying those things are bad, they're good, but they're not gonna work to help you change the way you wanna live your life. They're gonna help you feel calm, and that's okay. But what you need to do to change the way you wanna live your life is do the thing that makes you nervous. Provide your kids opportunities to be uncomfortable. I didn't send one teacher an email my daughter's entire career, with one exception to this guy who was really weird in high school, and he was just on KSL for things, so I was like, I feel like I went with the right gut there. But other than that, she handled all of that on her own, to the point where now she doesn't like call me for anything unless she's stuck, and she has this weird thing with Ubers, and she can never think she can get an Uber. So I do still get phone calls about that. But for the most part, she handled her life. And I've screwed it up a lot too. I've screwed it up in my own life. I have dug in that riverbed in many areas of my life of avoidance. Right? But the more we provide ourselves opportunities for discomfort, the more we provide our children opportunities for discomfort, and we allow them to figure it out, the better. When my son was 4, and this is my last story before the Q&A. When my son was 4, he was learning how to walk. And it took him a while to even get there. We didn't even know if he was going to be able to walk. And we were in a Target parking lot, and his sister is about 4 years older than him. She was about 8 at the time. And we got out of the car, and it was like springtime. It wasn't raining. That, I feel like, is a good point of clarification for the story. But we get out of the car, and I was parked in a handicap spot, and so I didn't have too much to get to the front doors. So I was trying to teach him how to walk on his own. And so he got out of the car, I helped him out of the car, and he sat on the ground because he immediately just thought he couldn't do it. But that's not how things work in my house, regardless of intellectual ability. So he got up, he walked a few steps, he sat down, and he was kind of behind my car. I made sure he was safe, but it really scared his sister. And so she went up to him, and I was just like, Deke, you gotta walk. You gotta walk. I know this is uncomfortable, but you've gotta walk. And his sister went up to him, and she kind of got in his face, and she was like, look, you don't know her. She will make you sit here. She will make you sit here. You will get hit by a car. You've got to get up and walk. And so he got up, and he did walk with her into the store. And I thought that maybe it was a little like of a wake-up call for me and the intensity that I push this area of my life. But to this day, I mean, he can walk. I fought with him today coming in from the bus. I make him walk from his chair into the house, and he always thinks he needs to hold my hand, and I pull my hand and tell him he can walk on his own because I want him to walk on his own in his way. So the more that we shelter, the more that we allow the people that we love in our life to avoid the things that are uncomfortable, the more we're just defining their identity by dependency. And we want the people we love to feel independent. So I think this is scheduled to have a little bit of a break here if people need to leave. But if you would like to stay, I would love to do an open Q&A and answer any questions you have. I think it's beneficial to do it in this space rather than just coming up individually because I've learned that everybody has the same questions. So I think that there can be like a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we'll just pop right into the Q&A. And was there something else that needed to be said? I thought that, yeah. Okay, so even as people are walking out, I have a mic runner, cute little helper. Anybody have the first question? Oh, great, we already have quite a few. Why don't you start right here? Yeah, thank you for standing. It's really helpful when you stand and raise your hand.
All right, I'm embarrassing my kids.
I love that.
So, I mean, I don't want to be the first person to talk, but I do.
Okay.
The reason why is because everything that you said really resonates with me. Just a little preface. I've always tried to teach my kids that we all have goals, we all have dreams, we all have ambitions, we all have things we want to accomplish and change and whatnot. And if the ability to get those things was within our comfort zone, we'd already have them.
Correct.
So the only way to get them is to go outside of our comfort zone, and the more we do it, the more our comfort zone expands, and then all of a sudden, now it's not uncomfortable anymore, right?
Exactly.
You know the acronym I'm sure you've heard of, fear, false evidence appearing real. As soon as you face that fear, all of a sudden you realize it's controlling us much more than it needs to, because 95% of the time our anxieties, our fears, whatever, never come to fruition. So, you know, my question is, as a parent, and even as an individual, how do we self-expose? How do we get ourselves to do it when nobody's around, nobody's inspiring us to do it, forcing us to do it, pushing us to do it? I make my kids sometimes walk down, you know, the wrong entrance at Walmart, you know. I'm not supposed to do that, Dad. That's okay.
Yeah. I love that. No, great question, right? I think that really is the biggest question people have, to be honest, is how do we develop the type of self-motivation to push ourselves into doing something uncomfortable? For me, it's a framework and kind of like a framework of energy. Where do I want to spend my energy? Do I want to spend my energy in safety? Sometimes, some days I do. But most of the time, I want to spend my energy or use my energy, my motivation, to do something that feels different than what I'm comfortable with. And so if something uncomfortable is being bad, we demonize it a lot, like, oh, that makes me uncomfortable, or I don't like the way that feels, or I don't like the way that people are when I'm there. We demonize that to the degree where it provides us like instantaneous justification for avoidance. We're just like, oh, well, I'm uncomfortable, so I shouldn't do that. So we really have to, I think the step number one is to work on framing how that can become a value rather than something to be feared or avoided. How can we learn to value discomfort? And that's, we could spend the next 45 minutes talking about that individually, but I think that that's a really subjective process. For me, I've learned that when I have been uncomfortable, that is when I have been the most vulnerable, the most authentic, the most connected. Intimacy can't exist without discomfort. And so I like to remind myself of that when I'm in a space where I don't want to push myself. There's not a magic ticket answer there, but I do think it's framing it in a way that it reminds us of what we value rather than what we fear. Yep. Next question. Great. The worst part is being the mic person, because then everyone watches you bring the mic to them and it sucks. So sorry.
I hope you don't know one, my fifth grader. But I have a fifth grader with extreme OCD just right and
Great.
anxiety. And she, if she doesn't know how to do let's say a math problem the first time,
Yeah.
she loses her mind. And so we're trying to decide, do we push her to just work through that math problem, just try and get it done, or do we say, take a break, take a breather, come back when you're ready, trying to figure out which way to break. So do we,
Yeah.
which one do we do? Do we torture her and say push, or do we just let her take the, it's not easy.
No, it's a tightrope for sure. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, great question. The first thing I want to point out there is effort versus outcome. When I'm working on exposure with anybody, myself included, it's how much energy, again, I'm coming back to that word, what's the max effort that somebody can put out rather than if she finishes or he finishes the math problem or not. So I don't care about that. I care about them pushing through that level of discomfort to the point where the suds drop to a manageable level, and then they can do what they need to do. So it's not so much content specific. It's not so much about your child completing the math problem as it is process specific. The idea of, oh, I don't have to let these automatic thoughts drive my decision making. I can push through this and feel uncomfortable. I don't really care if they finish the math problem or not. So it's a completely different framework of looking at it. And effort versus outcome will literally guide you through all kinds of exposures at home. And also, parents being exposure coaches totally blows. Like, it's the worst thing ever. And so trying to have a way in your family to kind of systemically do that in a way so you don't lose the role of parent and become therapist will be really helpful for you as well. But effort versus outcome, manage the suds, manage the level of discomfort. If we're at a 10, take a break for 2 minutes, come back to it. Does that help? Okay. Next question. Great, we've got a kiddo right here. He's standing up. Yep.
I'm still trying to think of how to phrase it, but sometimes I go over the top of 10 and I don't know how to control my anxiety. So what do you think are some ways to help drop that anxiety?
I thought you phrased that beautifully, but can you keep your mic for a minute? Can I ask you a question? Do you mind? When you say go over the top of 10, what does that look like for you?
Just not really wanting to do anything, just wanting to shut my door, close my blinds, and just lie on my bed doing nothing.
Yeah, you're like maxed out, right? So I think when you're at a 10 or at your max, and going into your room, shutting your door in a safe way, and being with yourself for 5 to 10 minutes. 10 minutes is my rule, though. No more than 10 minutes. Then you have to come out and redo the thing that you didn't want to do. So sometimes that helps our brain put less energy towards the not wanting to do it and the maxed out feeling, and more energy towards the, I might just want to do this and get it over with. When you give yourself a boundary or a limit like that, it can be helpful. I do that to myself all the time. I literally max out over the top of 10 probably 50 times a day, and that's not an exaggeration at all. And so I have to give myself a timeout. Sometimes I'll go grab a Coke from the kitchen. Sometimes I'll take a walk around the house, whatever I'm doing. And then I go back and do the thing that I didn't want to do, or the thing I was afraid of, and tell my brain that that's not scary, right? Because if we avoid it, we're just telling our brain that's scary. And we don't want to do that. We're in charge of our brain, right? Does that make sense? Do you have another question on that?
Oh, perfect.
Great question, bud. Thank you for asking.
I was just wondering if you have a website someplace that we could go to review this or share it with people at home?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mind if the school sends out the PowerPoint. I have no copyright issue with that, but I do have a website, jennyhoweconsulting.com, I think. Isn't it? Yeah, it's .com, jennyhoweconsulting.com. And I think if they scroll to the last slide, you'll see that on the screen. Oh, there's my dog again. Nope, looks like I didn't even put my own website on there. That's fitting for me. Those are great resources, though, if you want to take a picture of that slide. But yes, I'll make sure that the school sends out in their email a link to my website and information. Yeah.
I'm from Lehi Junior High. It'll
Great.
go out on theirs also.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'll connect with the person who set this up and have them do it to all the feeder schools.
All right.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I guess my question in a way is more for your niece. Because
Oh, great. I love this.
I loved her story, but I'm imagining a situation in my house where I'm taking a dead bee, I'm shoving it in the face of my daughter who's terrified of bees, and it sounds like torture. Thank you for that word. And I'm thinking, how did your niece get to the point where she wanted exposure therapy?
Oh, well, I'm going to answer that part and then let her talk.
Okay.
There's no such thing as wanting. That doesn't happen. We don't ever want discomfort. We frame it as a value, but we don't want it. I don't like to go to the gym. I don't go to the gym. It's probably, I need to not avoid that, but I don't like to work out, right? But it's effective if I do. So it's never something we desire. It's something we acclimate to. You know how when you go into the Pacific Ocean, it's super cold, and you get in there and you're like, this is so cold. And then like 5 minutes later, your friends on the beach are coming up to you and they're like, hey, how's the water? And you're like, it's fine. That's the process of acclimation. So you can tolerate it, you can acclimate to it, but you're not going to want to be cold ever. That makes sense. So Taylor, I'd love for you to share that. That's awesome. Chet has your mic.
Yay, the microphone's back.
You can stand up.
Okay, so at first I would just hold it in like time increment. What's the word? Time.
For a specific amount of time.
Oh, it definitely was forced at the first time. When she was like, my mom was like, Taylor, I have a surprise for you. And she opened it, and it like mailed it for my grandparents in Hawaii. And she was like, there's a package for you. So she opened it in front of me, and there was a bee, and then I ran and hid in my room. But, so I had to like first hold it, I first held it for like 5 seconds, then 10 seconds. And I don't know.
So how did you get to the point where you would hold it, I think?
It started just in her room.
Yeah, just like in my room.
She definitely tiptoed into it.
Yeah.
And so exposure therapy for most people is a
work
tiptoe.
into it. Mm-hmm.
Right? And so you can say something like, especially when I work with kids or somebody who was her age when she started, there's a reward attached to it as well. Bribery. Yeah, bribery is great. It gets a bad rap. Honestly, like I don't know anybody who does something that they don't want to do without a reward attached to it. I mean, this has been discussed in science since the beginning of time. So bribery is great, and there's ways to structure it, right? But there has to be something that's more motivating than the discomfort in the beginning. And then you acclimate, and you don't need to attach a reward. The reward is innate at the end.
Because for sure at the end, I was glad I did it, even though I was so young. I was like, now I can actually hold a bee. But then I was able to tell my friends in school, I was like, I have a pet bee.
Because Taylor wouldn't go anywhere where bees could be.
Yeah.
So think about how impactful that is in the summer. So it's not just a bee.
Like there's this one time we were at the Hogle Zoo and we were in line for the train and there was bees and I wanted to run, but then you were like, you have to stay here. And then she forced me to stay in line.
The aunt has a little more pull than the mom though, so I have to say that.
I had to listen
it's
to her.
really hard as a parent to be in the position to do this until it becomes a system, right? We talk a lot about family systems. Families operate like a business. And until it becomes part of the family system that we do hard things or we do uncomfortable things, there is definitely like an extinction burst or a learning curve where there's a lot of resistance, right? I don't know if there's a lot of people here that work at schools, but anytime there's like a new principal, everyone's like, haha, we hate this principal, blah, right? There's a learning curve to anything new or uncomfortable, and then everybody turns out to love that principal. So it becomes a system, and it becomes something. I think the most powerful thing we can do as a parent is model that. So I would say out loud, this is the hard thing I did today, or I would do something really uncomfortable in front of my kids. I would make a practice of that because modeling as a parent is way more impactful than what you say or what you try to force them to do. So it becomes a part of the system over time. But in the beginning, there's a huge extinction burst for sure. They'll do it though. Never had a kid resist it. Ever. They get oppositional, they might go to their room for a minute, they might walk out of my office. I've had a computer thrown at me just once. I've had a lot of things happen, but they do it. So if you're willing to ride out the discomfort you have watching your kid be uncomfortable, you'll be golden. It's usually the parents that can't ride out their own discomfort. You're welcome. It looks like over here, maybe. Let's try that side. We haven't gone over there yet. And my shoes came off. Sorry, I was maxed. I was at my 10. Okay.
So I have a couple questions. So,
Great.
Let's see. How can like parents help kids do exposure without creating like resentment or like making the kid feel like they're being like abandoned or something?
Ooh, I'm so glad you used that word. Thank you for bringing up this topic. I think that parents sometimes feel like they are doing the wrong thing when they guide their kid through discomfort rather than remove the hard thing from them. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, as parents, we really want to protect our kids from things that are hurtful or harmful. And I think in our society right now, again, this is a little bit of a soapbox, we've really sensationalized this idea that parents are to protect us. We've kind of swung this curve to the other end of the extreme where, you know, 50s parents, right, they let you run outside, or 80s parents. My parents never knew where I was my entire life, but it could have just been my experience. But, you know, we've swung to this side now. The pendulum has swung to where we overprotect our kids, helicopter our kids, try to make things as comfortable as we can for them, and that's a problem. So what that has led to is for those of us who don't have a relationship with the people who love us that feels safe, we feel abandoned, or we feel like our parent is leaving us out to do this horrible thing if they don't help us immediately, right? And so there's no such thing as being abandoned by a parent who is with you in a process of discomfort. Abandonment is about not being safe, not about being uncomfortable. And those are two very, very important distinctions. It might feel unsafe in your body, but that doesn't mean it is. Feelings aren't facts. Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. What about resentment?
Oh, you'll probably be resentful for a little while. That's just a given. I mean, I don't know how we move through resentment until we develop our own confidence, right? You did this to me, you did this to me. Oh, thank you, I'm so glad you did this for me. And anybody who has an older child, like I do, finally around, she's 20 and a half now, I get a little bit of like some tokens sometimes. I got a happy birthday shout out this year, so I was like, whoo, we're getting somewhere. But I think that's just par for the course. If your teenagers or your children don't resent you, then you're doing something wrong, in my opinion.
And then,
yes.
Sorry, one more.
That's okay, great.
On the slide before this one, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't understand. Do you think you could take us through that?
Yep. Will you go back a slide? I don't know if I'll have time to go through that. I won't have time to go through all of that, but what that is a slide about how to manage your anxiety in school. And there are different ways to do it, and I will talk about one thing that I think could be really helpful for you. Because one question that I often get from people is, how do we do things that we can't expose our kids to? Let's say you have a kid who's afraid of kidnappers, right? Probably not gonna like set up a heist and have them kidnapped. It's probably not gonna be super helpful. But what you can do is this really cool thing, hijack your brain to make them feel that way. I know that sounds awful, right? But there's this idea of worst case scenario. We avoid it. Oh, don't think of the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is not gonna happen. I have a completely opposite opinion on that. I'd like for you to think about the worst case scenario, just don't live in it. So I want your child to tell you, I'm afraid of being kidnapped, and this is what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of them coming in my room through the window and then snatching me, and then I won't be able to see you again, right? Whatever their story is. I'd have them draw a picture of it. I'd have them write it down. I'd have them give it some room to breathe so that their brain learned that that scary thought wasn't anything to be scared of. That's something we can talk about. It's something that's okay. And then they will acclimate to it. So we can hijack our brain for these like scary things we can't like really expose our kids to by doing pictures and scripting, by writing stories about those things. And you'll see a lot of resistance to even that in the beginning, because if any of you have ever woken up from a bad dream, you know exactly what that feels like. It feels like panic, it feels like fear. Even though you're not living in it, your brain doesn't know the difference. And so to create that type of an exposure with your kids, pretty easy, right? You could model that. This is the dream I had last night, or this is what I'm scared of, and this is my picture. Are you scared of anything? Let's draw a picture of what you're scared of. Do you see how different of an approach that is, rather than, no, let's just think positively. That's not gonna happen to you, it never happens. Kids aren't kidnapped, I'll keep you safe. Total different approach. But this one encourages empowerment and not being afraid of our own thoughts. And the second one encourages dependency. Yes? That's great, I'll repeat it.
So everything sounds great. What do you do when the thoughts do actually get scary? When they get seriously scary?
As in, give me an example.
Self-harm.
Okay.
Suicide.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Parents, you're not good therapists. I mean, that's
Terrible therapists.
Yeah. So I think that's where we worry about the,
Without a doubt.
Yeah. How far do we push before we're like?
I have a really solid rule, whether this was my own child or any of my clients. In fact, I just went through this. I have a therapist who works for me and talked her through this yesterday. If somebody is threatening to harm themselves in a way that's going to be impactful, whether that's like cutting or suicide, I don't take any risks. The exposure is, you have that thought, we're gonna go to the hospital. You have that thought, we're gonna call the county emergency crisis team to come get you evaluated. And what that does is allow me, as the parent or the therapist in the situation, to then assess the lethality of the actual issue. A lot of times, people that just have suicidal ideation, I don't want to say just because it's a very painful experience, but people that have suicide ideation, that's a very common part of depression. But we don't know if that's going to turn into suicidality until we treat it. So I don't mess around with that. I always treat it. And then I go back to, in session with my clients or as a parent, talking about where that thought came from. But if somebody is to the point where they're expressing that, that's important. There are some other pathologies I won't get into today where that becomes really kind of a way of testing parents sometimes. And in those cases, we treat it differently. And there's a great book, if you guys want a resource for that, Stop Walking on Eggshells. It's about caring for people that kind of use attention seeking or abandonment as a tool in their life. But for the most part, if it's based in anxiety or depression, I have a solid rule that we treat it as it's a serious threat. And then that person knows that, okay, if I am suicidal, hey, they're gonna take care of me, great. If I'm not suicidal and I don't wanna go to the hospital, I'm not gonna tell anybody. Like, I'm not gonna pull that card again, so to speak. So either way, it gives me a good gauge. And I think there is this resource also in York County. I know in Davis County where I live, or I don't live anymore, but I did for a long time, they have a mobile crisis team that is like a little non-emergent. Well, they'll come to your house rather than going to like an ER, which is usually a really uncomfortable and not helpful experience for a lot of people. So if they'll have a therapist come to your house, talk to your child if they're in crisis, and then give you, an evaluation to whether or not they should be hospitalized. And I think that's a very, very fantastic resource. And I wouldn't hesitate to use it. So, does that answer your question? Do you have another one? Oh, the mobile crisis team. So look at I think Utah County would likely have this as well. They have some pretty good mental health resources, but it's called the mobile crisis team. It's typically ran through the county mental health. Well, now it's called the Huntsman Mental Health Institute, also offers a similar service. I would imagine they have outlets down here that do it as well. But those are my two go-tos in the state. Yes? What? Oh, yes, 988, yes, and that's helpful, I think, but I think I hope, I'm anxious to see how that rolls out, because it's such a new resource, and I love that we have that now, but I'm anxious to see how helpful it is. So, but 988 is wonderful, but I would suggest anybody that's dealing with this in their home to also get a mobile crisis team number at your ready. Any other questions? Yes.
Just first, real quick about the 988. I've heard that goes straight up to uni.
Oh, cool.
So it just ends up being the same thing.
Thank you. I didn't know that. I appreciate that.
So I have a 15-year-old son with severe germophobia, OCD. So one of the things that is the hardest part of that is that there is an actual real fear at the base of it that is based on, everybody could get sick. Like there is a real danger, whatever the risk level actually may or may not be. How do you approach that differently? Like for instance, washing their hands over and over again. We don't want to, people are supposed to wash their hands, that's good hygiene, but obviously when you're doing it 20 times in a row, that's way more than you need to do. If someone coughs or sneezes near you and you freak out, the likelihood of you're actually getting sick is there, but it's probably pretty small. So how do you approach that when it's something that it does have a basis of a fear in reality, but they're just blowing it up, making a mountain out of a molehill?
Zero difference. All fear has a basis in reality. It always does. It could be irrational, but it's all based in something real. So this is a very common subtype of OCD. It's the thing that's most popularized we see in TV shows and stuff like that. But health anxiety is kind of a less severe form of it, and a lot of people really suffer from that, especially after COVID. But the way that we treat it is by response prevention, and I didn't go through a whole lot of what that is, but it means give limits. I explained to the young man over here that he could have 10 minutes to reconcile himself. For somebody who's hand washing, they can wash their hands once. And if they continue to wash their hands, they're not engaging in response prevention. They're feeding the fear. So there are rules that we give that are appropriate, but then we also do exposures. I've had kids with contamination OCD climb into dumpsters, lick the side of it and eat a donut, drop it on the floor. Those things aren't gonna kill you. They're not fun. Nobody wants to do that. But you get over it real quick. There's a technique in psychology called flooding, which isn't always it's never fun. But the idea behind it from a behavioral perspective, and there's actually a program that was initiated in, I think it was Denmark, where they did research on this for like 15 years to treat OCD. Now we have a program in Texas where it's waitlist only. It's really hard to get into. We're piloting it here, where they bring people with severe fears or OCD, and they do 4 days of flooding. Like, you're scared of germs? Okay, you're gonna go touch the toilet seat. And it works. This is the treatment. This is exposure response prevention. Without actually addressing the feared outcome, you're not going to learn how to acclimate. You're not gonna be able to teach your brain that that's unsafe. So you and I don't need to go touch the toilet seat because we don't have OCD. Our brain doesn't tell us that that's unsafe. It just tells us it's unsanitary. What I need to teach people is that that's unsafe. And so with OCD especially, like, no parent should ever be responsible for like managing that full time. OCD is a pathological disorder that has to be treated with a trained professional. If you're trying to manhandle that at home, good luck, because it's a beast. But yeah, they're all real. I have a kid right now who's so deeply afraid of COVID, based in COVID, has severe contamination OCD. We're working on him taking off his mask in the lunchroom to take a bite of a sandwich. That's how much we're tiptoeing into this. And I had him do one where I had him sit on a dirty piece of carpet and just touch it. And then I had him wait 5 minutes before washing his hands. So we're slowly training him that these things are safe. So it takes a long time. It takes a trained professional. But if the fear is real or if it isn't real, really doesn't matter. It's the same process for treatment. Okay, I think one more question and then we'll be done. Right here, front and center, you were here, so you got it. And just yell it and I'll repeat it.
I'd like to address the school proposal for kids who have body image issues.
Yes.
Days where the dead, so the day they make it, that counts as exposure.
Mm-hmm.
Days they won't make it out of bed because they're on the pen all day.
So remember my limit. Yeah, if they're saying they can't go to school, it's not that they can't, it's that they won't. Because they can, they go sometimes. It's actually not even exposure if they go to school, because that's just the expectation. An exposure would be, I'm gonna go to school wearing an outfit that makes me feel uncomfortable. That would be the exposure. Exposures and expectations, our kids don't get to live lives where like a simple expectation's their exposure. Unless they're pathological, put the little asterisk there. But to avoid something all day is a can't do, is a won't do, not a can't do. Now, if that kid is really depressed and you're seeing this increase in duration, frequency, intensity, right? They become more violent with their outbursts and refusals. They won't allow you in the room. They won't, leave to go anywhere where people may see them in a particular outfit, something like that. Then that's when you require the assistance of a therapist. But if your kid is just not wanting to go to school and has these reasons, which are valid and real, that's a different issue. The expectation has to shift. Now, they might refuse. My daughter in 7th grade refused one day, and it was the first week of my job at that place you guys just saw, and I was like, the irony of all of this. She was in 7th grade, we had just moved. She was, I think, trying to test me, and she did have some anxiety, without a doubt, in a disordered way. But she was like, I don't want to go to school. I'm not going to go to school. I don't feel like it. I don't feel like going today. And I knew that if I let that happen once, she would continue it because I knew her. And so literally my first day on that job, it was a Monday, I had to call my boss and say, I got a kid with anxiety. I know I'm supposed to treat other people's kids, but I've got to deal with this right now. And I got her to agree to go to the car, and then she did her makeup in the car, and then we got to the school, and I had to say, if you can't make it in the school, then I'm going to go into the school and access support for you to walk in. If this is so intense for you that you can't walk in yourself, I'm happy to access support, the counselor, a therapist. I won't walk in with you because I think that that's uncomfortable, like a little embarrassing at that age, but I will access support for you. And suddenly she was able to walk in the school by herself. That's not always going to happen, right? We might have kids that are really oppositional. And again, that's when we seek outside help and support. This is not anything anybody should do by themselves. Right? We're not responsible as parents to fix our kids. We're just not. They're their own people. They're responsible to fix themselves. But we are in charge of providing them a life and a framework that gives them the empowering tools to know how to do those things on their own, to feel confident to do those things on their own. And we only do that by framing discomfort as a friend rather than an enemy. So it's tough. I know I come up here and like say, this is just what you do, and these are the things that you need to do, and it'll work. It doesn't always work, but if it doesn't work, great. Then you know you need extra help. That's it. That's just data collection. It doesn't mean you're a failure. It means that we need extra support. All right. Sorry I don't have my website up there, but I'll have them email it out. And thank you. Everybody stayed. That's really awesome. I appreciate that. Thank you. Have a good night.